Growing up as the only child of a single parent and in a town where there were lots of really stable big families, and growing up as one of the only poor families in a very wealthy town, and growing up with a mother who was sort of a bohemian hippie in a town that was very conservative, I think that's instilled in me a sort of lifelong sense of being an outsider. But then at some point, it happened to me after adolescence, I realized that most of the interesting cultural figures of the 20th century were also insecure outsiders. And then, a lot of my heroes became people who sort of made disenfranchisement and outsider status seem very romantic. And suddenly, the people who represented the status quo, the people who represented the mainstream, seemed like anti-heroes. And they were the people to be fought against. The captain of the football team and the people who were popular and wealthy, they were the ones who represented sort of like, static, archaic culture, where it was the disenfranchised outsider, my heroes who were like, musicians, writers, architects, poets, what have you. They were the ones who, to me, represented this sort of outsider ideal. I started playing music about 26 years ago. I'm 35 years old now, and I started playing music when I was around 9 years old. And I started out just sort of playing guitar, and my mother had a painting studio that she shared with a rock band. So while I was waiting for her to finish painting, I would sit and I taught myself how to play drums, and basically just being surrounded by musical instruments. My mother was also a pianist, so I would sit in front of the piano and teach myself how to play piano. Music to me was always just something that played a very significant role in my life. It wasn't something I thought of as a job. It was just something I spent all my time doing. Like, I have friends who go to work and their job lasts from 9 in the morning until 6 in the evening, 5 days a week, and that's their job, but they'd sort of define themselves through the rest of their life. They might be an attorney at work, but that's not really how they think of themselves. They think of themselves as, going home and going out to movies with their friends and playing tennis, whereas to me, I strictly define myself through my work. That is, my life's work is my life, is making music. You can't make your living going down to the local disco and sitting around and playing guitar, but you can make your living going down to the local disco playing records. So I taught myself how to DJ and was DJing 3 or 4 nights a week. A, because I enjoyed it, but B, it was also a way to sort of make money and pay the rent and be involved in music at the same time. I was making music in my bedroom, which is where I make all my records. I think as long as I've been making music, I think I've only made 2 or 3 songs in outside studios. I pretty much do everything at home in my bedroom. And I was working on this song, and then I watched the first episode of Twin Peaks, and I heard the strings from Laura Palmer's theme, and I just fell in love with them. And so I put the strings on top of this song I was working on, and it made a nice little fit. I was signed to this teeny little record company in New York called Instinct Records, and they'd put out, I think, 2 or 3 other singles. The biggest selling one had sold 4,000 copies. And when we first put out Go, I was desperate. I thought, okay, if we sell 4,000 copies, I'm going to be the happiest musician in the world, because the single I'd put out before Go sold 2,000 copies. And I was like, wow, wouldn't that be great to be in the ranks of musicians who actually sell 4,000 copies of a single? And then it went on to be a top 10 record in England, and I think it sold, 500,000, 1 million copies, so certainly surprised me. And then after I made Go, I made a bunch of other singles under different names, because the label I was signed to in New York, I was pretty much their only artist. So I would make singles under different names, so it would make it seem like they had a lot of different artists. And then I spent about 1.5 years trying to get off of that label. They had signed me to a terrible contract, as often happens. And I spent 1.5 years in a nasty legal battle trying to get off. And while I was trying to leave the label, I spent my time touring and doing remixes. And so basically that's why it took a while until the first real album, Everything Is Wrong, came out. When I was 16, 17 years old, I was very active in the sort of hardcore punk scene. And a lot of times you'd buy hardcore punk records, and they would have essays on them. And this was the early 80s, so the essays would be about, how bad consumer culture was and how awful Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were. And they were all naive essays, but they were, seemed like a nice vehicle for communication. And when I was signed to Instinct Records, they wouldn't let me put essays on my records. But then suddenly I was signed to Mute Records, and Daniel Miller, the owner of Mute, actually encouraged me to sort of express my beliefs through the work that I do. So that's why Everything Is Wrong was sort of, filled with essays and quotes. I think a lot of people, A, were confused by the record because it was a very eclectic record, and B, they were kind of confused and surprised that here's someone who came from the world of dance music who had a social conscience and who was, addressing certain political issues. And some people loved the fact that I was outspoken politically and socially, and some people thought it was absurd. If someone likes what I do, I read the reviews, and if someone doesn't like what I do, I try and ignore it. And I know that might be bad, but I don't see the point in getting depressed about a bad review because there's nothing I can do to change it. Unless a bad review is really well put together, like if it's very cogent, then sure, I'll pay attention to it. But a lot of times bad reviews just reflect the idiosyncratic biases of the journalist, and they really don't necessarily tell me anything about the work that I'm doing. A lot of my musical heroes are people that experimented with different types of music, and it seemed like it used to be kind of acceptable. I think of the Beatles, and compare I Want to Hold Your Hand to Revolution Number 9. Compare Glass Onion to Magical Mystery Tour. It's like sonically they experimented with so many different things, and at some point in the 80s or the 90s, people started to expect musicians to just make one type of music for their entire career. And I think that's so unhealthy and so limiting and so boring at the end of the day. There's so many wonderful different types of music in the world, why not experiment with them? So when I made Animal Rights, that was just the record I wanted to make. I wanted to make a sort of visceral, aggressive record. And luckily I'm signed to a record company that let me do it. One of the nice things about being a musician is it's my prerogative to make whatever type of music I want. And that might sound selfish, but I think any sort of creative output is kind of inherently selfish. And you can still serve a purpose through the work that you do, but I'd certainly rather make records that surprise and shock people than records that bore people into complacency. When I make a record, I'm alone in my studio for a long time. And I write the songs in my studio and I play the instruments and I do the engineering and the production, and there's really no one else involved. So I lose perspective very, very quickly. And my only agenda in making a record is I want to make a nice record. That's all I care about. And using these old vocals, I really didn't care whether they were old or whether they were new, whether they came from America or whether they came from Canada, whether they came from Japan. I don't really care about the original context of where these vocals came from. I'm interested in it, but that's not why I use them. The reason I use them is because they're beautiful, wonderful musical performances. They could have been recorded 10 minutes ago, they could have been recorded 100 years ago. That doesn't really matter to me. Just what matters to me is the universal human emotional quality that they have. The old vocals that I used on Play, I discovered them by accident. I was out to dinner with a friend of mine and he gave me some CDs that had these old vocal recordings on them, and I just fell in love with them. And the nice thing is they were really well recorded and they had a really beautiful quality to them, so I sampled them and basically wrote new songs based around these old vocals. I use a lot of different criteria to judge the records I make. I judge them from a songwriting perspective, from a musician's perspective, from an engineer's perspective, and from a producer's perspective. So I can listen to certain songs that I've made and think that they're awful just because I don't like the way the kick drum sounds. It could be a great song, but the engineer part of me says, oh, the kick drum sounds bad, therefore the song is a failure. So when I finished Play, I lost perspective, and I didn't know if it was a good record, I didn't know if it was a bad record, I didn't know if it was an average record. When I finished it, I really had no idea at all. We got some good reviews and some average reviews, 1 or 2 bad reviews, and that seemed normal. And it was selling pretty well. I think in the first 6 months it was out, we sold about, 400,000, 500,000 copies worldwide. And I was amazed. I was like, wow, great, we've sold 500,000 copies worldwide. That's phenomenal. That's so much more than I ever expected. And now we're up to almost 5 million copies worldwide, and it's been #1 in 5 or 6 different countries and platinum in 16 different countries. So much more than I ever expected. I really thought that the fate of Play was going to be the fate of a lot of sort of interesting records. It would come out, get a few good reviews, I'd play a few concerts, and then the record would go away. I never expected it to have the sort of life that it's had. If Play had been an unsuccessful record, you know, there's a good chance I wouldn't have had a record contract anymore. And there's a good chance I would have been relegated to that tier of musicians who at one point had a little success and then went on to be, you know, I hate to use the expression, but sort of has-beens, at least from a public perspective. It's hard when you make records and when you're a public figure, to some extent, you do base your perception of yourself on the way you're perceived in the media and as a public figure. I wish that weren't the case. You know, I wish my self-esteem came from me, and I wish my sense of self came exclusively from me, but no, if I have a successful record, it makes me feel better about myself. And if I have, you know, if I play a concert and people like me, it makes me feel better about myself. And that's dangerous in the long run, but at the same time, maybe it spurs me on to make better records. You know, if I was complacent, if I was self-satisfied, I don't know if I'd work as hard making the music that I do. Life now, after play has been so successful, is really not all that different to my life before play came out. I live in the same apartment. I live in New York. I have the same friends. I eat in the same restaurants. You know, a year and a half ago, we were touring Europe doing summer festivals. This summer, we toured Europe doing summer festivals. The only difference was where you are in the bill and how much you get paid. But really, I mean, the material circumstances of my life are pretty much the same now as they were a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. The thing about making money is I don't really spend anything. I mean, the only things I spend money on, I constantly reinvest in my career. You know, I spend an awful lot of money on the production for live shows. You know, I can tour and, you know, in 3 or 4 months make $1 million touring, but spend $1.5 million on personnel and production costs. So I'm making more money, but spending more money on my career. Buying nice things for myself just doesn't make me happy. It doesn't really improve the quality of my life. You know, if I'm gonna go out and buy a watch, I'd rather have, you know, a cheap watch for $20 than a really fancy watch for $2,000. You know, it doesn't make time go any slower, any faster. I was at a dinner party a few weeks ago, and one thing about New York is very fashion driven, and it's very difficult for me to take the world of high fashion seriously, because the people who are involved in the world of high fashion take it very seriously. And my feeling is, yeah, you're making nice clothes. Terrific, you know, big deal. You know, it's like, why, you know, there are people out there who are running needle exchanges for, you know, junkies and AIDS patients. They should take their work seriously. There are people out there working on, you know, vaccines for different diseases. They should take their work seriously. You know, me, I make records, you know, and I take that my job very seriously, but I don't take myself very seriously. And it's hard when you see someone like a fashion publicist thinking that, you know, their work makes a huge difference on, you know, that they're going to impact millions of people in a very positive way and change the world, you know, make the world a better place. And the truth is, they're a fashion publicist. You know, it's a nice job, but you can't take yourself too seriously. So it's strange when you go out to these fashion parties and, you know, people are all full of themselves and they're arrogant, and it is very difficult to respect that type of arrogance. It's impossible to generalize about big groups of people. You know, the big, rich, famous celebrities that I've met, some of them are really nice, some of them are jerks. You know, it's the same as if you were to go to your local pub. Some of the people in the local pub are really nice, some of the people in your local pub are people you don't want to hang out with. It's, you know, the world of celebrity is no different than any other demographic. After my mother died, you know, I was thinking about life and death and romance and attachment, and I started wondering, you know, if you spend 20 years with someone and have a wonderful 20 years, but then they die and you're miserable, in some ways, on a very logical level, doesn't that compromise or negate the 20 nice years that you had? You know, it's kind of like if you're healthy for 6 months and then you get a really terrible flu, when you're desperately sick, you don't remember being healthy, you know. And the same thing, you know, if you've spent 20 years in love with someone and then they die, they get sick and they die, it seems like you're just consumed with misery. And I'm not saying that's a reason not to get involved with people, but it's certainly something to think about. And why involve yourself in something that potentially is going to make you terribly, terribly sad? Like why, for example, we were just in Spain, and a friend of mine wanted to rent mopeds for he and his girlfriend. And I said, you're a fool, because you can rent a car, and in your car you're protected. You rent mopeds, neither one of you know how to ride a moped, there's a better than likely chance you're going to fall off and get really badly hurt and ruin your vacation. So why enter into something when there's a great chance that you're going to get really badly hurt by it? And it doesn't mean to be a shrinking violet and stay inside and never go out, never go out and expose yourself to risk, but calculated risk. Because there's a part of me that sort of aspires to domestic bliss. Part of me aspires to meet someone, fall in love, get married, have children, have tons of animals, live in the woods, have friends over for dinner, make music, and go swimming, and have this nice domestic life. And then there's another part of me that wants to just devote my life to making music. Sometimes I think of music as my wife or my very intense mistress. And sometimes being married to music is wonderful, and it's the most sublime, rewarding thing in the world. Other times it's mundane. Other times it's downright unpleasant. I'm single, I'm autonomous. I sleep in a different bed every single night when I'm able to sleep. And so I've made a lot of sacrifices, but at the end of the day, I have a life making music that I wouldn't trade for anything. Being a musician and being able to reach people through music is a very noble calling. And that's something that that's something that I want to pursue for the rest of my life.